And the crazy thing about grief is I always think like, okay, every person is going to grieve at some point. Like we're all going to be grievers,
Yep.
but we're so awkward and weird about it.
And that is one of the things where I just want to talk about it more. And I don't know that I did in the beginning, but I just feel like the more we talk about these things, then hopefully the less weird it is.
Welcome to A Place of Yes. I'm your host, Heather Straughter. This is a podcast about how I moved through my darkest hour. And all I can say is I dug deep, figured out where I was and where I wanted to be. And for me, the answer was in a place of yes. Welcome to the show.
I am really excited to be here today with Jessica Fein. She is the author of Breathtaking, a memoir of family, dreams, and broken genes. I just finished this book this morning, actually. I ordered it from our bookstore, and honestly, once I picked it up and started reading it, I could not stop. Before I just start gushing about how wonderful the book is, can you talk a little bit about you and your story and kind of give my audience a little bit of a background, if that would be great?
Yes, absolutely. And first of all, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for getting the book, and thank you for not being able to put it down, because those are all three great things. So Breathtaking is the story really of how my husband and I built a family, loved a family, and lost a lot of family along the way. We got married, met in college, got married a few years later. I mean, we definitely had a pretty long dating trajectory before we got married, but we then thought we were kind of going to follow a conventional path, and things, to say the least, did not turn out that way. So we went through many, many years of fertility treatments before we came to what turned out to be like best, most exciting decision to adopt our children. And we adopted 3 children from Guatemala. And we thought, now the surprises are over, and now we're going to go on that trajectory. But when our middle child, Dahlia, was 5, she was diagnosed with MERF syndrome, which stands for myoclonic epilepsy ragged red fibers. And it is an ultra rare form of mitochondrial disease. And it's a degenerative disease, which was all just like foreign to us. Everything about what I just said was foreign to us. Mitochondria were foreign to us. The diagnosis was foreign to us. We didn't know what a degenerative disease meant. When Dahlia turned 9, she caught a cold, and that cold landed us in the hospital for 3 months. And at that time, she lost a lot of functionality. She lost her ability to walk, to talk, to eat, to breathe without a ventilator. And when we came home, everything in our world was different. Our house was essentially an ICU for 8 years. Dahlia passed away 2 years ago, 1 week after her 17th birthday. And in that time, we watched as the disease took more and more of her functionality. She was an eyes-on patient, which meant myself or my husband had to have our eyes on her, or a trained nurse in her care at all times, 24/7. And we were both working also during this time. And we had these 2 other children. So that's kind of the plot, if you will. But what the book is about is how I went from being somebody who thought I could plan things and who was very comfortable in the world of I can fix this and believed that we had some control, to understanding that none of that is true. So how do we create a life of meaning and joy in the context of huge uncertainty, in the context of we don't have control? How do we give ourselves, our family, our children a life of joy in the midst of the most unimaginably tragic circumstances? And how can those things live together?
Well, there's something you say in the book, and you talk about how, 2 things can be true. And that you just kind of touched on that idea. And that's, I think, what connected the most for me. So my story has certainly some overlap and some similarity to you. My husband and I met, we got married, we had our son, Ethan. Then we wanted to have a boy close in age. And so then Jake was born. And we lived in Boston. He was born at Beth Israel. Mm-hmm. And we ended up wanting to move back to where my family was. My husband was the youngest of 5. There were already a ton of grandkids. I'm an only child. My mother's an only child. My dad only has 2 brothers. They're just only one who had kids. So we're a small family. And as soon as I had kids, I was like, I want to be home. I want my kids to grow up with my parents close by. We waited, ironically, until Jake was born healthy to make the move to upstate New York. Boston's a great place to be if you have a sick kid.
Right.
talking about how when you think you can control your life, right? And you think that
Yes.
you can make these things and you make these decisions and they matter. And then the universe shows you otherwise. So
Exactly.
when Jake was 8 months old, he had a seizure out of nowhere. Unconventional seizure, like I didn't even know it was a seizure. It was just his hand twitching.
I have to just tell you, I had that exact same thing. I had no idea that that was a kind of seizure, the hand twitches.
And I just was like, this is weird, but it was a little bit that mom questioning, like, wait, this isn't right. And I knew if I called the like pediatrician's office at like 2 a.m. and was like, Jake's hand's twitching, they would be like, settle down,
Right.
come see us in the morning. I just knew it was not right. So I'm like, we have to go to the emergency room. So long story short, we went to the emergency room. They did not have a pediatric neurologist anywhere in the area. They were going to send us to Syracuse, which ironically is where my son goes to college now. I was like, if we're going anywhere, we're going to Boston. Like we lived in Boston. They were born in Boston. Boston Children's is there. So we made our way to Boston and we were there 117 days. Those stays, when you describe that in the book, I remember that life.
Yeah. When we first checked in, I make it sound like a hotel.
A hotel. No,
Right.
I say that too, though. Yeah.
Yeah. But when we first got there, I remember saying, so we were admitted, we were in ICU. Dahlia actually got sick in Florida. So we also had to make our way to Boston. But once we got to Boston, it was 1 week before her 9th birthday. And I remember saying to the person who admitted us, I said, can you please just promise me we'll be home for her birthday. And he said, I can't do that, but you won't be in ICU anymore. He said, well, we were in ICU for more than 3 months. So we absolutely had her 9th birthday party in the ICU.
Jake's first birthday party was at Boston Children's,
Ah.
not in the ICU on the floor, but still adapting to these moments, right? Like these moments, and you're having to learn so much. And to your point where you're like, I didn't even know what mitochondria was. They were talking about things with Jake that I was like, thank goodness we live in the era of like Google though. I mean, maybe not so much for the doctors, because I'm not sure they always loved my like mom diagnosing things, or like, I think there's a side effect, or did you know? Like I was a big like, did you know? Did you know? But just this unknown world. So Jake ended up, he lost all his milestones, 8 months, he was he was self-feeding, he was cruising, he was crawling, he was keeping up with Ethan, who was 15 months older. Like he was doing things, you kind of think, oh, 8 months old, they're still babies, but he was doing a lot of stuff. He lost all of that, never to regain it. You say at one part of your book, like if you knew that was her last smile, you just, would you have done anything differently or whatever? And I think about that with those moments. Like if I had known that was the last time, I'd see him smile completely independently by choice. If it was the last time I saw him crawl, the last time I saw him like sit in the bumbo chair and feed himself, it can be heartbreaking. It can almost be as heartbreaking as all the rest of it. One of the things I have a question for you is Jake was never diagnosed. So he passed away when he was 4. So we had a shorter time with him, never got a diagnosis. And up until he passed, we did most of his early care was at Boston Children's. Once he finally came home, in the beginning, we were going back every 2 weeks.
And it's interesting because what you're describing and the life that we both lived became slightly understandable to people during COVID, because now nobody wanted to get anything because it could become COVID. And for everybody, this was like such a shocking way to live. And I was like, welcome
to our world.
Yeah,
exactly. Everyone would always be like, oh, it's just an ear infection. I'm like, you don't understand. Like
No
for
just.
Ethan,
No
yeah,
just.
like for Ethan, kind of, yeah, it's just an ear infection. For Jake,
Yeah.
this is like a trajectory that can go south real quick, but never got a diagnosis. And in those early days, in that first hospital stay, I was so desperate for a diagnosis, so desperate for like an answer, because I felt like if I had an answer, then I knew what to do. And I remember once the doctor said, he was like, Heather, you have to stop. Like we are trying to find some of these things out, but you need to understand that if some of these things come back positive, it's almost worse. Everything we're testing for is tragic, is horrible. I was thinking, and I don't know how to even say this the right way, but you had a diagnosis, so you kind of knew what you were up against. There's no right answer, but I just wonder, like, what do you think? Like,
well, I think it's such an interesting question. And I have to say, I've talked to so many people who don't get a diagnosis, right? Which would have seemed unimaginable to me before I knew people who were in that situation.
Well, especially you're at Boston Children's Hospital.
Yes.
It's not like,
But I will tell you, they had never seen MRF syndrome at Boston Children's Hospital. They had not treated somebody with MRF. So we actually went to Mass General after starting at Children's. But I thought if we had a diagnosis, then we'd have a trajectory. If you have a diagnosis, then you can start treating it, right? I mean, I
have a plan.
I didn't know what I didn't know.
Yeah, exactly.
And in fact, you talked about Google, and Google is great, and Google is like horrible because we get this diagnosis, and what they told us was we cannot begin to understand what the trajectory will be in terms of timing, in terms of intensity, because MERV syndrome and many mitochondrial diseases can manifest in so many different ways. And sometimes it can be fatal, and sometimes you can just have migraines. And even within a single family, you can have people who have the same diagnosis and it manifests very differently. So they couldn't tell us the speed. They couldn't tell us where it was going to show up. I went home, of course, and went to Dr. Google and, memorized every single thing. And the problem was that Google was like a menu. It might manifest this way. And it gave like this list of choices. So I was like, okay, does that, like, I can take short stature. Like, that's okay.
I'll take that one, but I don't want that
right,
one. Yeah.
Dementia, no. So we had all these things looming that might happen, but we didn't know what would happen. So yes, it was a diagnosis, but there was so much mystery surrounding it. And then when she got her secondary diagnosis years later, which was a different kind of mitochondrial disease on top of the first, that was so rare that the doctors said they only had seen 6 cases like that in the world.
Which is wild, because I do remember some of the testing being done. They were like, this test, there's like 2 people who have had this maybe. Like, they're testing for things that is they don't know.
Right. They don't know.
Funny that you say Mass General, because we ended up Jake's care. We switched to Mass General as well.
Oh, really?
We had reached a point where, and again, maybe it was a little bit of the non-diagnosis. So there was a little I was a little naive. There is no trajectory, so let's just forge ahead, And we ended up finding a doctor who specialized in the ketogenic diet. There was like a program that was, I don't know that it was hard to get into, but I sent a very impassioned mother email of I feel like you can help my child. We started over there with neurology, and then he had some bone issues where just his bones broke horrible, so we took orthopedic over there. There was just a few both great institutions. I felt it after I was more well-versed, which is a weird way to say it, but sort of once I knew sick, I felt like Mass General it fit our family structure a little better.
You had another child. I had 2 other children. We worked, I don't know if you both worked, but I mean, you have other things, your life shrinks so much when you're in the hospital, and everything gets put on hold. But there are some things
that can't be put on hold.
Right. Your other kids.
At first, I was very much and I remember you reading this a little bit, or reading about this in the book, when you guys were in Florida and you were like, okay, we're going to, you just keep thinking it's going to resolve. When we were there, I was like, it's going to resolve. It will work itself out. And so Ethan was with my parents for a while. They would drive him down. But then it became clear that we were here for the long haul. So we ended up having a hotel room. So my husband stayed every night at the hospital. It reminded me a little of your husband. He was that guy, right? Yes. At 2 a.m., it wasn't me.
And
I was
unusual.
the one.
I mean, for us, the nurses and doctors were shocked. They'd always be so complimentary of him too. Dad, which I'm sure if I was doing the exact same thing that he was doing, nobody would have said anything.
No one said it. Exactly. Right. I was good first thing in the morning because I would get there. I'd always want to get there for rounds, and I'd be like, okay. And I would remember stuff that Brian wouldn't, for instance.
I love when there's a complementary skill set, which we definitely had, and it served us so well, and temperament. And that was really important as well.
Yep. It's so hard to share this part of your life with even the closest friends and family, though, right? Because
nobody gets it.
All those things you said, right? About work and the other siblings and just life.
And that is one reason. There are many, but that's one reason why I wanted to write the book, because I feel like so many of us, more than one would think, are living this life and people can't get it. And you can't go out for coffee and explain it. So maybe if you sit for a couple of hours and get into somebody's head who's going through it, you can understand it.
When I talk to other families that we've worked with or people on this podcast, the theme that keeps coming up is loneliness, right? Because you're just lonely.
And that's why it's so great, because when you do meet somebody, I feel like you and I have known each other for years, right? We just get it. We understand where the other one's coming from. So I do think there's such beauty in bringing people together. And I don't think it has to be over the same disease, right? I mean, you 100%. Are in a diagnosed situation. It doesn't even matter. We understand what it means to be in the hospital for more than 100 days. We understand what it means to be trying to juggle, So
all of that, yeah.
And, but I think the loneliness one is so interesting because we feel like people can't get it. And even people who want to be part of it, it's hard. It's hard for us and it's hard for them. And I know very early on, before Dahlia got really sick even, but after her diagnosis, I remember thinking, my close friends are in a no-win situation. If they start saying things to me like, oh, my kid sprained her ankle in gymnastics, that's like offensive. You
Yeah.
know what I mean?
Yep.
On the other hand, if your good friends can't tell you that their kid sprained their ankle in gymnastics, then what kind of friendship is it, right? So it was like, and I was aware of that. I don't know that it helped at all, but I just thought, God, they're kind of in a no-win situation.
It's funny you say that because I have had those exact same conversations and thoughts. I would sometimes even tell them, I'm like, just so you know, you can't win here. I want to hear, I'm your friend, I want to hear, but I'm also going to be aggravated that the worst thing that happened to you today is that.
Right.
You
I
know,
remember one of my friends went on, I don't remember where, but went on some like totally exotic vacation. This is one of my best friends. Like we knew everything about one another's lives. And she went on some totally exotic vacation. And somehow I ended up on a group text that I wasn't meant to, which had a picture of her. And I was like, what? And she had been trying to be thoughtful and not telling me, knowing what we were going through, that she was going off to wherever, Mallorca, making that up. I don't remember where it was.
somewhere great. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, oh my, I felt so left out, but I also understood where she was coming from.
Yep. People don't know what to say, so they say nothing. And saying nothing, to me at least, sometimes is worse.
I think saying nothing is worse. I think and so I, by the way, write a whole column for Psychology Today called Grace and Grief on these topics. Like, what do you say? More important, what should you not say? I mean, we had somebody at Dahlia's funeral say, my God, I can't imagine. I know I have a daughter that age. I just can't imagine. It was like, well, that's great. I'm really glad you don't have to. And they're just trying their best and they're trying to, like, that. And yet people say, inadvertently really hurtful things. And the crazy thing about grief is I always think like, okay, every person is going to grieve at some point. Like we're all going to be grievers,
Yep.
but we're so awkward and weird about it.
And that is one of the things where I just want to talk about it more. And I don't know that I did in the beginning, but I just feel like the more we talk about these things, then hopefully the less weird it is. So at Jake's funeral, there was someone who was whispering. So, I know I'm biased, but adorable boy, Jake, cute as can be. He was in his favorite fuzzy little outfit. He was, it's horrible. He's 4-year-old, had a red casket because red was kind of his color. Someone was like whispering where I could hear, oh, I can't believe they had an open casket. He's only 4. No one wants to see a 4-year-old. I was like,
oh my God. Oh my God.
I mean, I
Do you
was
not want to turn around
literally,
and be like, can you leave?
I didn't even say it as nicely, I think. There might have been an F-bomb involved.
Good,
But like,
So
I
deserving
just,
of an F-bomb.
and that's where I'm always like, what do you mean? Like, it's still my boy. It's still my son. Like, we can talk about this. Shut up. Like, why are you
Shut
here?
up.
Yeah.
I had a woman, Myra Sack, who wrote a book called 57 Fridays, was just on my podcast, and her daughter, Javi, died at 2. And she was telling me that when she goes to order coffee or places where they call off the name when you place an order,
yeah.
she uses her daughter's name. She said, because I love to hear her name said out in the world. And I loved that so much because I feel like another way people are weird is they don't want to bring up your kid. And it's like, wait, so now my kid is gone and I never get to talk about her again because it makes you feel right. And so I love that. And I think it's so important for people to hear that we do want to talk about our kids. We do want to hear their names. We do want the pictures, the videos, the way we don't get to spend time with them. The way we spend time with them is by talking about them, is by looking at pictures. I went out to dinner with somebody I hadn't seen in a long time recently, and we were talking about my other kids. And the guy says, so what are they passionate about? Like, what are they really into? And we're talking about it. And then he said, what was Dahlia passionate about? And I wanted to just stop the meal and go give this guy a hug because I felt like that was such a gracious thing to do. Like, why should we not get to talk about that anymore? And so it was, just he wanted to know about those kids and he wanted to know about Dahlia. And I loved that.
So I have all of these unprofessional, unorganized quotes that I wrote down because really when I was reading your story, just a lot of what you talked about, like I said, it so resonated with me. And not just because we both have lost children, but because it is just such a great viewpoint on life. Right? Like, and honestly, I laughed at one thing I wrote down because I say this no less than 10 times a day. And you basically wrote, my life is a shit show. But so it's not one of these like, okay, this is the literary moment of the clip of the book. And this is where it's almost where I think anybody can read this book and anybody can learn from this book and anybody can just, joy's not the word, but like this idea that we can live these really full lives and you can have all the chaos going on. And whether it looks that way because you're parenting a medically fragile kid or whether it looks that way because you've lost a child or you've lost a lot of significant people in your life, you can still have this really full life that has joy in it and that you make this great thing. So I kind of feel like that statement applies to most people.
Yeah. Well, and I have had feedback from people who are in totally different circumstances from ours, who have read the book and said it's really made them think about things differently. And so I feel very gratified when people tell me that our situations are so particular, but that doesn't matter because every single person is going to have loss, has, uncertainty, as we were saying at the beginning, is going to have hardship and wants to have joy. And so for me, it really was a bit of a transformation to learn and experience that these two things can be intertwined.
A friend of mine recently lost her daughter, and one of the first things she said to me was, am I ever going to laugh again? Like, am I ever going to be happy again?
And if I do, will I feel guilty?
So what I said to her is, yes, you will. And those first few times you will feel guilty. Because I don't remember the exact moment, but I remember being out with friends and having drinks and laughing and feeling like myself again. And for a minute, like not identifying totally with that soul crushing feeling that I had just didn't think would ever leave. And I remember then almost feeling more heartbroken that even I had found this moment, right? Like where I could just not be drowning in it. But then also that's okay. So that's kind of what I said to her. I was like, you're going to have it. I promise you. And then you're going to feel a little bad about it maybe, but then you're going to learn to exist with these two very big parts of your life. This life where you can be full and happy, and this life where you will never fill that hole.
Nothing great can happen without there being this little, sidebar of, but what, I had been through quite a bit of loss. And after I've lost both of my sisters, when my first sister died shortly after, my now husband proposed to me. And I mean, that moment to me sums up more than any other, the two things living together, because I was over the moon excited and, whatever, and devastated right at the exact same minute. How could I possibly not be able to call my sister right away and tell her? That was the first experience I had of how do these things live together.
I think it goes back to talking about it, right? Or like really thinking about it. For me, and I think for you and for these podcasts and the books, it's giving this space for people, I think, to think about it and to feel it. I feel a little bit like here I am. I just turned 50 and now I'm doing all of the things. I'm like, I'm 50 and now I understand all of the, I'm very wise now, apparently. Overnight, I've become a wise soul. I do think that there is such importance in these conversations. And I sometimes look at older people in my family who don't have these conversations, right? Or who have not talked about it. Or when you always would bury something that was, and that doesn't work well either. So I just do think that things like your book and your podcast and A Place of Yes and these things are just important ways for us to share our stories, but also give room and space for other people to share their stories.
I absolutely feel like I have become so much more comfortable with sharing because I understand not only that it might be useful for somebody else to hear a story that may or may not resonate, but also if you don't put yourself out there, then you don't get the feedback, the support coming back at you. And it's interesting because I mentioned at the beginning that we had a very long journey to parenthood, and I went through years and years and years of fertility treatments. At that time, first of all, it was a while ago, so people did not talk about it as openly. And I thought, this is like the single most personal thing that could possibly be happening. Why in the world would I tell anybody?
Yep.
To me, this is between me and my husband. Like, I don't think we told anybody for years. And meanwhile, it's like completely dominating our life. And once I did end up having to tell people for a variety of reasons, it was amazing. It was like I got support. I got people who said, oh my God, I'm going through that too. It really was an eye-opener for me about the value of sharing.
Well, it goes back to that when we talked about loneliness, right? Like,
Yes.
because you were in that sort of alone and didn't even occur to you that you could be in that not alone, right? That it was
Exactly.
just going to be you and your husband. But then when you open it up a little bit, like I've always said, well, I think there's a ton of negativity with the social media and all of that. I do love how it allows people to connect now.
Yes.
I have met
it's so many people in the grief, in the rare disease community, and writers. I mean, when I was working on this book, I connected with so many writers and it was, around COVID. So everybody was connecting online. But what a totally huge gift that was. And that would have never happened without social media.
Like Jake had already passed when a lot of Instagram and Facebook and some of these groups were around, but I have just met families and people still that part of me wishes it existed with it. You know what I mean? Just because I was like, oh, it felt, I remember just how alone it felt. I want to talk about one thing where our worlds have sort of collided. And I think it's kind of exciting. I just put this together, honestly, a couple hours ago. So one of the things we did after Jake passed is we started an organization called Jake's Help from Heaven. I wanted it really badly, for some of the things we talked about, an opportunity just to keep talking about my boy. I felt like I talk about Ethan all the time. He's an athlete. He's always was doing stuff. I wanted something in which I could keep saying Jake's name, right? So it's called Jake's Help from Heaven, kind of self-explanatory name. And we didn't know what we were doing when we started. We knew we learned a lot of lessons. We knew that we learned how to advocate. We learned what families needed. We learned how to fight with insurance to get stuff. And a lot in your book, when you talk about your house being an ICU, and when you talk about when the electricity went out, you needed to get the generators going. Like, we have bought generators for families like yours, where like,
Our kids' lives depend on it.
Kids' lives depend on it. Like, we have paid national grid bills because of that. Like, because, there are these machines, they have to be working perfectly all the time. We can't, there's no like, oh, it blipped. You have to have it going. So what basically Jake's Help from Heaven does is we're a grant process. We help families. We always say that kind of look like ours, but just where we can provide items of medical necessity, items of medical convenience. One member of our Jake's family is Daniel DeFabio.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
Wow.
So when I was reading your book, I was like, hey, I know that name. And then I was like, oh, wait, for some reason, when I'm reading it, and it's such a beautifully published book, I was like, oh, this can't be our worlds colliding, And then I was like, wait, but she lives in Boston and we're here, so it's not that far. And then I looked, same Daniel DeFabio. Lucas, we did a ramp for him. We had done some other things.
Oh,
and
wow.
So small world.
I have such a great story of how we met. There is a terrific organization that you might know called Magic Wheelchair.
I saw it at the end of your book, and I did not know it beforehand.
The first couple of Halloweens when Dahlia was in her wheelchair, we made amazing costumes incorporating her wheelchair. But it was just, my family, sitting in
Just
our
what you
living
did.
room, kind of cutting things out and whatever. So we made like Elsa's sleigh and whatever. But in researching that, I came across an organization called Magic Wheelchair. And what they do is they take families where there's a child who's in a wheelchair and the families apply for this, and they find local volunteers who might be professional artists, professional builders, or just, great people who want to do this, who build these spectacular costumes based on incorporating the wheelchair. This is so important because you might not think about what a kid in a wheelchair is going through on Halloween. Everybody's running up and down trick-or-treating, and the child's in the wheelchair, which maybe they can't even wheel up to the house. Maybe they can't eat like Dahlia couldn't. I mean, there's so many things working against them experiencing this holiday. So at any event, we met with these terrific people, and Dahlia wanted to have a My Little Pony wheelchair, which is just the most amazing thing that they built. The folks from Magic Wheelchair ended up contacting us and said, the Rare Disease Film Festival is happening in Boston, which was being run by Daniel DeFabio. We had no idea who that was. We would like to unveil Dahlia's wheelchair there. So that's how we came together. And,
in the course of Jake's now, we've worked with like 1,000 different kids, but I was like, I know that name. And I was like, this would make sense.
So I love that. I love that.
Great?
I thought where you were going to go with it when you were talking about your organization was to ask about Dahlia's wish.
Which I would like to talk about too, because that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm so excited. So this is with Mito Action, which I'm on the board for Mito Action. And what we do is we send kids who have a confirmed mitochondrial disease diagnosis to Give Kids the World Village, which for people who don't know, if you go on a wish trip to Disney, which we did through Make-A-Wish, you stay in this most miraculous place called Give Kids the World Village. That's your home base. And you don't really even need to go to the parks because that place by itself is so magical and totally accessible and run by volunteers, and all the other families there look like yours. It's just such a great place. So now through Dahlia's Wish, we send a number of families every year to Disney to Give Kids the World Village.
That's awesome. I always say, people are always like, oh, you've turned such a tragedy into something great, blah, 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 blah. And I'm always like, well, it's actually a little bit selfish because I love. Like, this is the world I know. Jake's been gone 13 years now, but it's still the world I know. Like, I understand things. Like when, Jake didn't have a trach, but I know a lot of kids that did. I know that, in that fear, right, of like when you talk about like when her room became an ICU, like there are things that I remember like it was yesterday. Like, and I remember also becomes a time when it doesn't become scary anymore. And that's almost sad in its own way, right? Or like weird in its own way.
God, that's so funny that you brought up that particular example, because the day we got home from the hospital, Dahlia's G-tube, so that's for people who don't know, that's the feeding tube in her belly, popped out. Oh my God, like we thought we had to go back to the ER. Now, it turns out that's really not an emergency. And it really takes about 3 seconds to put it back in. But it was the scariest thing. Changing the trach tube, that's life and death. And I'll never forget one night my husband was making dinner. He was like cooking a chicken. And at the same time, he like put that on hold for a minute, went him, scrubbed up and changed her trach and then went back to cooking the dinner. I was like, oh my God, our lives have changed.
It's like you have those moments, right? Where you're like, okay,
Yeah.
Wow. It's quite a journey. The book. So you're kind of on a little bit of a tour, it seems like, I saw you're going to Los Angeles.
Yes, if anybody is listening, well, depending on when this airs, but I will be in LA at Zibby's Bookshop, and I'm going to be in Ann Arbor at Literati, and I'll be in New York over the next, I have it kind of scheduled over the summer. And of course, if you're in the Boston area, there is no shortage of great conversations happening around the book because I'm in Boston. So it's only been 2 weeks. So I don't know. So far, it's been great. I mean, what I love is being able to have conversations with people who have read it. And again, people who read it and are like, oh my God, I felt like you were describing so much that we could relate to, oh my God, this is so different from my life. And yet, so I really have enjoyed it. Again, it's 2 weeks in, but
it is an awesome accomplishment. It is so great. I am so happy that I like randomly sent you a message one day.
I am so happy that you did that too.
I am. I remember it was kind of funny. Like I was, with the podcast was relatively new and I was I don't even remember how I like found you, but I was like, again, the good things of social media, right? Like I remember we were actually in Montreal and we were about to go out for a cocktail and I was like, nope, I'm going to send like 3 emails out and I'm just, I'm going to plug the podcast, see what we can do. And before we left to go downstairs, you had replied and I was like, all right, now we have something to celebrate. Like, let's go have a drink.
I love that. And now we get to have you come on my show too.
Which I'm very excited.
I'm so excited to talk to you.
So I want to say that ambiguous grief is something that I didn't even know about until recently. So now I feel like it's all I want to talk about.
I feel the exact same way. And I have written about it. I also would recommend a terrific book by Stephanie Sarrazin on ambiguous grief, a very different kind of grief than you and I have experienced, but she's so smart. And her book is Soul Broken, and that's on ambiguous grief. But the funny thing about this whole term is I had never heard it before. And I was asked to speak on a panel about ambiguous grief. This was some years ago. And I said, yes, because, we want to be sharing our stories and we want to be spreading awareness. But I got off the phone and I Googled what's ambiguous grief. And it was like the skies opened and, angels started singing, because it was like, oh my God, I read about ambiguous grief, which for people who don't know is grieving the loss of somebody who is still here. It can mean one of 2 things. It can mean either the person is still alive, but they are not with you physically. Maybe they're a prisoner of war or something like that. Or they're with you physically, but not in the way they used to be. Maybe it's your elderly parent who has dementia. And so it's different from anticipatory grief, which is, I think, self-explanatory. But ambiguous grieving is the person is still with you. And I had always prided myself on saying, I am not going to grieve for my daughter when she is alive. Like that felt to me like it would be a betrayal. I won't do it. And yet there was so much to grieve, right? I mean, there was this future we had imagined. There was the fact that one by one, she was losing her functionality. And so there was so much to grieve. And when I realized that this is a real thing, that ambiguous grief, that it is okay to grieve things that you have lost for somebody who's still alive, but this is okay, there's a name for it. It was like such a gift, because then I felt permission. Then I didn't feel like I was betraying. Then I was able to incorporate it and integrate it and move forward with it instead of pushing it away and being in some kind of denial about it.
When Jake was first sick, right? Like when we were in the hospital those 117 days. And when we were home and he was in that world of early intervention, it was like PT and OT, like, and my house wasn't my house really, because it was like therapists in and out and like crazy train of, and just so different. Like it literally was on that one night, my life went from this path to this path. And I remember people saying, you have to grieve the life you thought you were going to lead. You have to grieve that Jake is something different. And I refused. Betrayal wasn't the word, but it's actually a better word for what I felt. I just felt like I was hurting Jake's feelings if I would do that. Like I was just so afraid of being hurtful that I could not do that. I didn't. Like I flat out, and I got sort of angry if people would suggest it, right? Like I was kind of like, no, like not angry, but just kind of, it was another one of those things where I would sort of like blow off an eye roll. Yet at the same time, I always told this story, and I still tell it sometimes on the podcast, of this struggle I had because there was this picture in my head before Jake had his seizure, before he got sick, when I couldn't wait until that next summer because we were going to go rent a house at like the Jersey Shore or something. And I was going to walk on the beach because Jake would be walking by then with one boy in each hand. Life goals, whatever you want to call it.
Yes.
One of the things that I would cry about was that never was going to be real. Like there was zero chance of that happening in my life. And now I understand all of that. Like I understand the grieving of that. And I kind of even understand that that would not have hurt Jake's feelings. Like that is a healthy process, kind of in the way you said that if you accept it, and kind of with all things, like part of the reason why I talk about grief all the time and part of the reason why I talk about Jake all the time is because these things help us move forward. They help us move through. They help us exist. What a great thing that this exists, because I wish I knew the term or read about it 13 years ago or 14, I guess more than that, 17 years ago, right? Like it would have changed the course of my grief a little bit. Like,
Yeah, I just feel like anything, when it has a name, then you can start to kind of understand it.
and you're not alone in it again, I think. And because I think for me, there was also guilt with it. It was kind of like, oh, does anyone else feel this way? No, like I'm not going to do the. And even though they were professionals sort of telling me that, in some ways I had to listen and be dependent on some of these professionals for so much. I was like, stay out of my personal life. Like, just don't tell me what to feel, you know? This is going to sound very weird, but there are times when, you know, like I said, Jake's been gone 13 years. It's like a lifetime ago in so many ways. It feels like I've lived so many, I don't want to say different lives, but just I wasn't always this comfortable talking about it. I always kind of do this thing like, what would Heather now tell Heather, you know, 35-year-old Heather when she was kind of struggling with some of this stuff? Like, where would we be in this journey? In the heat of it, in the heart of it, it's so hard to kind of remember that, right? Like, I feel like because you're fighting so hard to keep your kid alive, and it takes all your energy sometimes. It's hard to then balance it. And it's easier for me to balance it now because I'm not fighting as hard to keep him alive, you know? So tell me, what is your favorite thing, your favorite memory of Dahlia? What is that thing that just gives a smile on your face when you think of Dahlia?
I love how absolutely up for anything Dahlia was. Now, I mean, we could be going on errands and she would think this was the most fun thing ever. Like, it doesn't matter. Target was like our playground. You know, she
had good taste.
Being right. She just loved being out and about and interacting and just getting so much and giving much more from and to the world. I mean, so like when we went to Niagara Falls, she was the only one of the whole family who would ride under Maid of the Mist with me, or we'd go to an amusement park and she would, you know, want to be riding all the roller coasters. And I'd be like, no, but of course I'd do it with her. But it was just always this up for anything, amazing courage, sense of fun, and just beauty. And yes, physically, but that's not even what I mean. Just this beautiful, beautiful energy that she just put out there. And the great thing was, because she put that out there, people sent it right back to her, you know, and it was beautiful.
We have done this portion at the very end of the show sometimes. Sometimes the conversations, especially in the beginning when I would not like craft them as much to end on a high note, we'd have these really kind of heavy conversations. So the idea is that we do this portion of the show called Ask Heather Anything. Is there anything you would like to ask Heather? Ask Heather anything.
What made you decide to start the podcast?
That's a great question. We had been doing a lot of work with our organization, a lot of fundraising, a lot of raising money to give away. We've given away over $1.7 million in the last 13 years. So we're constantly on the hustle. And there was part of me that figured out, it was kind of that whole like work smarter, not harder kind of idea. Like I was working so hard with fundraising and selling ads for a t-shirt and raising money and all of this. And the idea was that the work we're doing is really important, less so, and people will believe in the work we do. So like, let's let the work speak for itself, and let's have a vehicle in which we can share more about the work we're doing and the families we're helping and the what's important, but not have it be about like, oh, you're donating to Jake's because, you know, you get a logo on a t-shirt. So we're trying to do this thing where we're kind of having the donations and the work either be to support the podcast or really just here's the stories. Like here are the kids we're impacting. Follow our Instagram. Like ask me questions about it. Like come on a delivery with us. This is who we're helping and why we're doing it. Support us for that. And this is an opportunity to kind of share with sponsors just more what we're doing. I just wanted to talk about Jake and our families and the kids and why we do it.
I love it. I'm so glad that you did start it.
So Jessica, thank you so much for being on this show, for sharing your story through this book, for talking with me about all the things.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a really, really lovely conversation.
Thank you for listening to A Place of Yes. Please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave us a thumbs up, or leave us a comment. We would appreciate all that you can do. If you really like this episode, please share it with a friend or two. For more information and to leave us any feedback, please reach out to us at jakeshelpfromheaven.org.